So we're going to get started. Dr. Maddox is an expert on African environmental history, and he's also the dean of the graduate school at Texas Southern University, in addition to his work as a professor of history there. He will be sharing a little of what he has learned through writing and co-editing numerous books in his talk, From Missionaries to Tropical Medicine to Global Health, Some Musings on Health and Healing in East Africa.
Thank you very much. And I want to, first of all, take this opportunity to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here and to talk to you, and I am very impressed with the level of scholarship indicated in the posters and the papers at this conference. And like I said, I'm very honored to be asked to be part of it. I want to start by trying to define the point of what I'm going to talk about today. Today's talk is an attempt to contextualize health and healing, especially Western biomedicine in Africa. And the examples I'm going to use are drawn from East Africa and particularly from Tanzania, which is where I've done the bulk of my research over my career. It's not so much to counter, but to perhaps complicate the triumphalist narrative that of the advance of health and well-being through the expansion of distinctly Western biomedicine into Africa. Historians generally use narrative to explain things, right? I mean, that's what we do. We talk in stories. And so what I'm going to try and do is tell a series of sort of connected stories about health and healing in East Africa, and so that we can begin to think about what the role of what I'm calling Western biomedicine, what its relationship to African societies are, and what some of the complications are of this encounter. Now, where am I? There we go. And we'll start off with a little bit. I don't know, some of this is, the very beginning is going to be real basic. This is just to sort of give you a little bit of background. We're really going to start with the colonial era. Africa was colonized in the late 19th century. And total period of colonial rule by European powers in Africa was relatively short for the vast majority of the continent. Now, this relatively short period, though, has given rise to a lot of, major debate. Some historians argue that this is, the most important rupture in African history was the short colonial era, while others argue that the change in the colonial era is superficial and independent of the direct political control that was exercised by European empires. In other words, what's going on is a broader process of what we today call globalization rather than just colonization. Now, it's also important to remember that Africa is not isolated before 1870 when you get the heyday of European explorers like Stanley and Livingstone and the beginnings of the scramble for Africa. Trade in both commodities and for West Africa, in slaves, had been extensive and predated the era of the Atlantic slave trade. Trade grew throughout the 19th century, and with trade, all sorts of different kinds of contacts. But until the late 19th century, there was little European colonization. Now, the final thing we want to remember here, and I always have to emphasize this because way back in the day when I first started teaching at a university and had to teach my first world history class, which is a freshman survey, the textbook that I was assigned to use, I didn't pick it, started off its section on the colonial conquest of Africa with the colonial conquest of Africa was relatively brief and relatively bloodless. And the problem is, of course, that's just not true. Conquest was very bad for population. The population of the African continent fell over the second half of the 19th century and the early 20th century. It fell due to warfare. Conquest was conquest and was resisted all across the continent. It fell due to, human-induced famine, the disruptions of conquest, not just the military actions, but the actual efforts to reconstruct African societies into something that would be productive for the new European rulers oftentimes disrupted food production systems and led to severe famines. One of the arguments that people often make about the effects of colonialism is that you had a greater velocity of disease, so that you had a series of epidemics throughout the late 19th and early 20th century that swept through different parts of Africa, some covering the whole continent. And disease is not just of humans. Rinderpest is a cattle disease that first spread into Africa in the 1890s and probably killed about 70% of the cattle population, which was a critical resource for many African populations. Now, so what you're seeing here is that with the late 19th century, early 20th century, in the middle of what one historian has called the Victorian Holocaust, or a term for the disruptions, not just in Africa, but in Asia, even to some extent in Latin America, that colonial rule in Africa, a more extensive European presence, is coming at a time when African populations are under severe press, when African people are suffering from probably, broadly speaking, worse health than they had in previous centuries or decades. Now, Western biomedicine comes into Africa in a major way at this juncture as part of the expansion of colonial rule. It comes in both at a formal level with European colonies attempting to construct health systems. The colonial health regimes, for the most part, focused immediately on the health of white people in Africa, not so much the Africans. But what reached more Africans, and in the particular case I'm going to talk about here in what's now central Tanzania, was mission health. So as Christian missionaries began the process of trying to spread their understanding of the gospel into Africa, one of the things that they both took as a service requirement of their calling, as well as a way to try and win converts, was to extend what they thought were the blessings of Western healthcare, of knowledge about healthcare, into African societies. And from the very beginning, the link between this proselytizing effort in religion and the spread of healthcare creates all sorts of complications. In central Tanzania, the very heart of what's now mainland Tanzania, the Church Missionary Society, an English missionary society, established its first outposts in the 1870s. They eventually focused at a place called Mvumi, a village that was the home of the most prominent, in the word in the local language, which is Chigogo language, Mtime. We can roughly translate it as chief, but in actuality, it means a little bit more than just chief. The political authority was tied up in concepts of healing, or in the case of the Gogo, the way they speak of it is cooling the land, okay, of keeping order in society, of making sure society could reproduce, so that the chief, the Mtime, was not just the political authority. He was also the ritual leader, and in particular, in this area, which is extremely arid, it suffers through severe droughts regularly, and during the colonial era had many famines. This ritual leadership was centered around propagating the spirits to make sure the rains came. In other words, the Europeans called them rainmakers. Now, in this case, Mvumi was the center, was the headquarters, was the capital of the most powerful chief in the region. A man who, in the 1880s, the man who became the chief was named Mazingo. And from the 1880s on, he fostered a close connection with the missionaries as an effort both to shore up his own political position, i.e. access to types of resources, both material and intellectual, that would allow him to both continue his dominance locally, but also to defend his position in the context of what was at the time German colonialism. Now, The interesting thing about this is that Mazingo, while he was, he was a chief, was himself a usurper. And that's part of why he turned to the missionaries for support. He was, in fact, created in office by the German colonial regime and was not the official heir to the position of chief in the region. And so in part, his link with the missionaries was very much tied up with strengthening his own position in local society. Now, he was very ambitious and successful African leader in the colonial context. He actually continued to be a chief all the way down to independence, very old by the time independence came, and was regarded as one of the most powerful traditional African leaders in Tanzania as independence approached, which, interestingly enough, he also was one of the earliest traditional leaders to back independence, too. So, and it's a continuation of this whole linking himself with the church and the mission establishment. Now, in this context, you have to recognize, you have to remember that throughout the first half of colonial rule in Africa, almost all across the continent, colonial states were little concerned with African health in and of itself. If they had their concerns for African health tended to be focused on Africans being able to work as laborers for colonial era enterprises, plantations, mines, or as peasants growing crops that would bring returns to the colonial state. There was little investment in health except in urban areas, and there again the focus was primarily on keeping white folks, healthy. In fact, throughout colonial Africa, the biggest urban initiatives for healthcare for Africans were segregation. In other words, dividing cities into African quarters and European quarters as a way of, keeping the diseased Africans away from Europeans. And like I said here, missions provided the basic kinds of healthcare, and this is a clinic run by the CMS mission in the 1930s. And it was there that, especially in this region, that people of central Tanzania first began to encounter in a regular way Western healthcare. Now, the thing about it was, it didn't work. It wasn't all that successful. The innovations that missionaries brought in the first half of the 20th century in healthcare were able to do some things to address health concerns, to address ill health in Africans, but not to address a lot of things. And in many cases, what they did was counterproductive. And this was the state of medicine at the time. It didn't stop, missionaries, Western-trained doctors from thinking they knew how to solve, how to promote better health among Africans. But Africans themselves looked at it and they did not see the benefits that these Europeans thought they were bringing to them. And as a result, missions or public health in urban areas continued to face what we might think of as competition, right? People's beliefs in healing and health continued to dominate the way they looked at issues of ill health. And to sort of simplify a little bit, healing continued to be seen both as a social phenomenon. In other words, the healing of society, the concept among the Gogo of cooling the land, the idea of of allowing society to reproduce through the appropriate exercise of rituals that propagated the elders and that maintained harmony with the nature spirits. And this not only at the higher level of a community reproducing itself, but at an individual level. If an individual was sick, it was because something was out of balance, right? There was a social imbalance that caused an individual to be sick. Europeans often call this witchcraft, The idea that someone was, in English, the term would be used is bewitched. It's not the term that in Kigogo or Swahili would be used for a person being ill. There was witchcraft. There's a specific concept of it. It's malvalent actions by people who have supernatural power. That's a very real concept among the Vogo and in East Africa generally. But it's not the same thing, as undertaking the proper rituals in order to bring someone back into harmony, And there's a very different term for that. The person who does it is an mganga, which, again, Europeans would often translate as wizard or warlock or something like that, But it could also be translated as doctor. Because it was a healer, In addition to the social elements of healing, healing was also symbolic, And I'm going to give you a good example of that later when we come back to this in a minute. But healing was, ritual actions were often undertaken as a way of explaining illness through symbolism. Okay? And I'm going to use the example I'll use here. It comes actually from the rain-making ritual that was used throughout the region to properly appease the spirits, whether it was elders who were displeased they were not being remembered, or nature spirits who had for some reason gotten angry at a local community. You had to sacrifice a black cow as part of the ritual. It had to be black. Couldn't be anything else. And the reason was because, of course, clouds were black, right, when they rained. And you wanted to call the rains, so there's sort of a symbolic linking between what you wanted and what you got. Now, of course, healing was also instrumental and pragmatic. Herbs were used, certain actions were taken that were known to have beneficial effects. And this is, in fact, the entree point more than the sort of theoretical approach of Western biomedicine. It was adopted where, it worked, right? So in some cases, in the early part of the 20th century, injections proved effective for different sorts, for the effective of different diseases. Yaws in particular could be treated through an injection, and the Swahili word for a needle or an injection is sindano, and so sindano becomes a word for going to the mission hospital and getting a shot to treat the diseases that they know they can treat, But malaria, for example, couldn't be treated. Could ameliorate the symptoms at this point, but you couldn't really cure it. You just had to keep the person, treat the symptoms and hope that the person survived. And so people didn't go to the doctor for malaria because that was not, it didn't help any. Now, from the health practitioner standpoint, from the missionary standpoint, this was all darkness and superstition, right? And what you'll see is when missionaries or doctors talk, or public health officials in the governments talk about this, they talk about these sort of what they call superstitious movements, particularly what's called witchcraft eradication movements, which really, again, the term is phrased here. They're purification movements that sweep through different, in central Tanzania, they're very common, in which their communal action is taken as an effort to try and, again, restore this harmony that seems to have been disrupted. And they continue right through to now, actually, in many cases, but particularly in the early and middle decades of the colonial era, they're quite prominent, especially during times of social upheaval. So you see an upsurge in them. Well, the Great Revolt that occurred in 1905 in Germany, East Africa, the Maji Revolt, was in essence a witchcraft eradication, purification movement. As the Germans increased the demands they made on Africans in their new colony. In the aftermath of World War I, which was actually fought in Germany, East Africa, it was a big campaign, there was another wave of them. Again, interestingly enough, by the 1930s, the Great Depression, which disrupted the local economies because of the fall in prices for commodities that Africans produced and decline in demand for labor, also produced an upsurge in them. Now, it's not just this sort of difference in ways of looking at healing and health as a concept that's not just a matter of the individual body, but is also a social construct. You also had a very, if you will, colonial imperative in healthcare, one that was extraordinarily paternalistic, even in what we would think of as the most well-meaning of the Europeans during the colonial era who operated here. I want to use the example here from Mvumi of a medical missionary by the name of Paul White. He was an Australian. The CMS mission in in Mvumi, in Dodoma, in Ugogo, in Tanganyika, was taken over by the Australian branch of the CMS after World War I. And so Australians manned the missionary. And Paul White was a doctor who came in the 1930s to serve in Mvumi Mission Hospital, which was quickly becoming the biggest hospital in the region. And he retired from mission service after about 10 years in the early 1940s. He, not unlike he and his family, they basically had health problems themselves, and eventually his wife got so ill that it was decided that he couldn't stay. And on his way back to Australia, in the middle of World War II, interestingly enough, so he's going back to Australia, and he's thinking about, and he's apparently very disappointed. He enjoyed being a mission doctor, and he thinking about what'd gone on. He decides he's going to write about it. So he writes this book, Doctor of Tanganyika, which is his little mini memoir of his experiences in the 30s up to about 1940 in Mvumi. And then he goes on to write a series of primarily children's books called the Jungle Doctor series. If you ever see these, they are a hoot. But there are these books that are all about, the great white missionary doctor with the, either naive, well-meaning, Africans, or, ignorant, superstitious Africans. That's your choices there, You got naive, and you got, and you got ignorant, superstitious, and there's one or the other, And throughout them, you can see both in his memoir here, and in these books become really popular. And they are distributed. He's a public figure in the 50s and 60s in Australia. The books continue. In fact, I think they're still in print. They often circulate in religious circles and in religious bookstores. And he did all sorts of things. He was on radio regularly and had a regular radio show, did early TV and all this kind of stuff. And eventually, Megan Vaughan, a historian who looked at these issues of the way Europeans talked about healthcare in Africa in a book called Curing Their Ills, does an in-depth analysis of his work. And that even though I've worked in this area, been in Mvumi and anything, a lot of what I'm saying here comes from Megan Vaughan's work more than mine. So, and he talks about this very sort of rigid hierarchical view of what has to be done to promote health in Africans. It is very much the white doctor who has to dispense knowledge. The hospital that has, is the place of cleanliness and light, and the Africans who are the childlike recipients of this. The African staff that works at the hospital. And again, we're not talking about a lot of Europeans at these places, right? You're talking about maybe 2 doctors. This is a big hospital. It may have 2 European doctors and, a couple of European nurses who oftentimes were the wives of the doctors, and maybe a couple of other staff, and of course they over the course of time after World War II in particular, the professional staff will grow, but, at the beginning, the 30s, it's not a big European staff. So who's doing most of the work, right? It's the Africans, the people who were hired as nurses, as lab technicians, as what the equivalent of physician assistant. They had positions, and they had a whole hierarchy of these positions. And he spends a lot of time in this book talking about having to train these people, and how hard it is, You know, this quote here, you need the wisdom of Solomon and the patience of Job in training Africans. You cannot drag people from the Stone Age into the 20th century in a few short months. He talks about, for example, he gives the example of one nurse in a ward, which, I mean, the nurse was loosely applied as a term, but this young woman was assigned to clean the linen, change the linen, clean the linen, that type of stuff. And one day, for some reason, she didn't do it. And so the punishment for her was that they not only made her sleep in one of the beds that she didn't clean, that somebody had been ill in, but they also went through the whole string of treatments that they would perform for different illnesses as a way of sort of punishing her, of showing her that this, you have to do what you're told here. Now, this hierarchical nature is, I would suggest, and I'm following in this is a conclusion that's shared by many who've looked at this, is embedded in the way healthcare is constructed in much of Africa, certainly in Tanzania during this time, in the 30s and 40s. Now, it becomes even more prominent even after World War II, which is a big turning point in the colonial era in Africa. Of course, colonialism is going to come to an end. You're seeing the rise after World War II of the independence movements and nationalist movements in Africa that are fighting that eventually bring independence to most of Africa in the early 60s, and then the rest of it on down to the end of apartheid in South Africa. But the end of World War II brought a renewed sort of focus on the African colonies amongst European governments. Britain, for example, quote unquote, lost India, right? Obviously France's importance, which is the other biggest colonial power in Africa as a global power, was severely compromised by the war. And African colonies are the ones they still held on to, so there was a lot more of investment in the colonies, and it included investments in health. And what we today call, the rise of tropical medicine. The idea that there's specific medical practices and specific disease questions that are primarily tropical. And for most of the truth of the matter is that when you look at these tropical health institutes that get created, they're really talking about Africa, They're India has a different thing, and Asia is totally different, and Latin America is totally different. But these are African issues and African problems. And as a result, you get truly more knowledge. And we're going to come to this debate about how knowledge gets generated out of this process in the next slide. And you get an expansion of healthcare facilities. You get clinics being opened, supported by governments in one form or another, often local governments that are generated in the colonial regime, manned by what they called tribal dressers. The name, they're medical assistants, and they have basic training, but this was the first term they used for them in Tanganyika, tribal dressers. New drugs, of course, become available in the aftermath of the war. And it's not just antibiotics and penicillin, which are critically important and again increase the ability of Western biomedicine to deal with some of the diseases that strike Africa. But I want to emphasize one in particular, chloroquine, which emerges out of the war as a treatment for malaria. And it really is important. When chloroquine gets discovered and begins gradually over the 40s and 50s to be used more widely, it makes a tremendous difference in survivability for people who have access to it. And it becomes widely available and probably does more than anything else in the 40s and 50s to increase life expectancy, and particularly in East Africa, Now, despite this, this creates a sort of an important point in the way healthcare works in colonial Africa. The paternalism that I talked about, that's implicit in the development of a sort of a colonial, a tropical medicine regime, is apace with what's been called in other fields colonial science. The sort of the idea that well, the idea that when you look at questions concerning everything from agriculture to health, that Africans don't know what they're doing and don't know what they want. And so you start your research problems with that presumption, and then you build up from there. The Kenyan historian Ozak Olumwala has phrased it as the view of Africa as a patient, and Africans as only patients, you know? Now, there's a counter to this argument, and this is important. Now, I don't want to make it sound like that what I'm saying is that you go straight from this sort of tropical medicine regime that I've talked about here into modern, what we today call global health issues, without there being significant change. There is, and it comes out of the whole process of not just political but intellectual decolonization. I mean, within the scientific and health establishments themselves, there are critics of this paternalistic view. Helen Tilley, in a very important book about British scientific efforts, not just in health, but in all sorts of different fields in Africa in the middle of the colonial era, has argued that these critics of this sort of paternalistic colonial science are the ones that eventually emerge as the dominant voices in scientific research, in health research. Yeah, in Africa. They're the ones that are arguing that we need to not, it's a little bit easier to explain in, say, for example, agriculture. They're the ones that are arguing that African farmers actually know what they're doing, that they've developed agricultural systems that are attuned to the environments they work in, and that while anything can be improved theoretically, but you have to start with what they know, and then you build up to what else you can do. And these are the real prominent. But even in health, there's really a critique more of the paternalism itself, not a questioning of the knowledge, but, a critique of the paternalism. One of the best examples Tilley uses that is connected here is as the British were trying to promote scientific research in Africa in the period, this starts in the 1930s and it goes on through the 1950s, a psychiatrist based in Nairobi comes up with the 5 minutes. Okay, I'll be quick. You want to hear about the psychiatrist, or should I skip it? Anyway, the psychiatrist comes up. He's going to measure African skulls to prove they're dumber than Europeans are. And in fact, this proposal, which is widely publicized in the white Kenyan establishment, is vetoed for funding. Because, of course, the medical professionals say that's crazy, So, what happens over the course, if we go forward with this, is that we see the professionalization of health institutions in Africa itself. And that's that's the key thing that happens over the 50s and 60s. You get the first cadre of African doctors trained in large numbers that become, the people who are the doctors and the nurses and the other technicians in African hospitals and clinics throughout the 60s and 70s. Now, yet this was a very vulnerable thing because the 70s in particular saw healthcare in decline. The availability of healthcare decline in Africa with the sort of a global economic crisis that struck Africa particularly hard, being dependent on raw material exports. And of course, the worst example of this are the failed states that we often think of when we think of Africa, places like Somalia. But even in some place like Tanzania, which is politically stable, the availability of healthcare, just absolutely cratered. The ability of the government to provide support for healthcare declined. Support from external sources declined dramatically, and you literally saw rising mortality rates, rising infant mortality rates, declining life expectancy, of which HIV and AIDS in the 80s was just the last straw. Now, since that time, I do want to say things have improved dramatically. And what I want to end on, and I misspelled that. What I want to end on is thinking a little bit about how things have improved and what some of the complications are that remain. Certainly, since the 1990s, in the economic conditions across Africa have improved dramatically, and there's been both national and international efforts to not just spend more money, but to think about how you spend money in promoting healthcare in the developing world. In other words, the rise of global health. And this approach has a lot to recommend it. It has been successful. Life expectancy in Tanzania is rising rapidly. Infant mortality has halved in 10 years, It's, and it is a result not just of money, but of thinking systematically about the delivery of health care, about how you organize it. It is, in fact, the types of research that goes on here. All across the globe, of course, but it played a critical role in this. Yet, it's still complex. One final example. I have misspelled the name. That's Loliondo, not Lolionod. D and O are mixed up. But in 2011, a retired Lutheran pastor in northern Tanzania announced that God had spoken to him and had told him that if he mixed the bark of a certain tree with certain other herbs and made a potion out of it, that it would heal people. And in particular, it would heal HIV/AIDS, high blood pressure, and diabetes. 3 diseases that I want you to think for a second we might think of as diseases of modernity, right? These are things that, there's no quote-unquote traditional definition of these things, One being relatively new, the other 2 being chronic conditions, that just you had to, are defined by symptoms that can't be readily seen. Over the course of 2011, the reports are 6 million people drove dusty country roads to Loliondo, where they would line up in cars and get 1 cupful of this potion. And now, and these were not, it was government ministers, it was my friends at the university, that went in, that believed, And I was there when it happened as it was going on, but, this is not the result of any special research on my part, and some of us were joking when it was going on, the event that launches 1,000 dissertations, right? But I think you can see again this sort of, the way that healing is not just a biomedical question of a body. It is a social and symbolic phenomenon too. And Babu Mwasapile, was the most famous person in East Africa for a year. There were the NIMRI, the National Institute of Medical Research in Tanzania, actually tested the potion. First of all, to make sure nobody was going to die from it. That was the first thing they said. But as it turns out to be harmless. It's nothing. And they still nobody in NIMRI has come out and said this is a quack. It's still under test. The mania died down. I was reading an article the other day from late 2012 that talked about rather than 20,000 people a day in these cars lined up to get there, now it was down to about 10 that would come by. And Babu means grandfather. Babu Masapile, one of the important symbolic things about it is he did not take much. Well, he took like 500 shillings, which is 30 cents for a cup. So it wasn't like this is obviously part of why it's important symbolically. He wasn't trying to get rich, right? But at the same time, this cartoon from the newspaper says, all the sick people have run to Loliondo. And that was the way people... Okay, well, I hope you found that interesting, maybe. Well, if you've got any questions, I'd be glad to take them for a minute or two. Yeah.
Yeah, with all the thousands of healers in Tanzania, what was it about this guy in Loliondo that caused it to take off? Because, I lived there for many years. People are making claims all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Yet this one rose to the surface and attracted. What were the components of that?
Again, I haven't done enough detailed research to tell you a whole lot. I can only, in essence, talk in symbolic terms, I think part of what goes on with him is that he is appropriating, not just a sort of what we might think of as a traditional deep-seated notion of social symbolic healing, But he's doing so, he's very explicitly a Christian, He is a retired reverend in good standing with the Lutheran Church. And he's doing it, he's obviously, we know this like 500 shillings a cup, he's not getting rich. Now with the 6 million people, I don't know if that figure was accurate or not, but that's a lot of shillings, that's a lot of 500 shilling cups. But, it was obvious that no one cup was going to make him rich. And I think and again, this sort of, the symbolism of the diseases that he said it could cure, it was important too, So this was sort of like a new revelation for new diseases, But I'm not smart enough to go beyond that, Yes, sir.
I found your historical analysis of Western concerns about labor
Mm-hmm.
and access to labor in Africa to have a modern parallel, which is it's very hard to be hospitalized here in Houston and not come into contact with the medical or linguistic profession from Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Because there is a conscious campaign to coach
Yeah.
where